In this video, I'm looking at the Tin Hifi P1 Plus Planar Magnetic IEM. Let's go. What's cracking, audio fans? It's David here from Prime Audio Reviews, and yes, we're here with the P1 Plus. Now, it was a couple of years ago now that the original P1 came out, took the world kind of by storm. Me included. I'm a big fan. I still am a big fan of the original P1. Here's the box for the P1 Plus, very similar to the original, but it's a little bit smaller, not quite as chunky, and they give you a better case this time. The other one kind of opened up this way, and it was really awkward to try and shove the IEMs in there. This one is nice, got a nice felt lining inside like that. And here is the P1 Plus. The only difference physically between this and the original model is the color of the protective mesh on the nozzle there. The original one was silver, the new one is gold colored. But apart from that, you've got the same stainless steel shells, built like a tank, very, very sturdy indeed. Also very small. Just look at them in comparison to the 7Hz timeless and you can get an idea how small these are. So they're pretty comfortable. One thing that I do find with the P1 model is the nozzle is a little bit short, so I had to pull out my big guns, and by big guns I mean some of my largest ear tips. Love these guys. And I had to do that in order to get a nice secure fit and seal. But yeah, we've got the same build quality, really nice, very small, comfortable in the ear. A little bit tricky maybe to get a fit, but for me, the big ear tips did the trick. The other difference physically between this and the original model is the cable. Now, the original cable was very similar to this one, but it had this really loose braid, and it kind of looked uneven. It doesn't really look professional. It looks like very much like a DIY job. The Tin Hifi have listened to criticism and they've fixed up the new cable. You've got this nice tight braid on it now, still high quality copper cable, and it's pretty nice. MMCX connectors, as you can see there, and a standard 3.5mm single-ended termination. Right, so how does the Tin Hifi P1 Plus sound? Well, just like the original model, you can see from the frequency response that it is very flat. And a lot of people kind of consider that type of flatness, that linearity or neutrality, to be the holy grail of audio. And in some cases it is, but in a lot of cases it's not. For instance, having a flat frequency response is very good for content creation, such as editing videos or music, mixing music, creating music, things like that. You want a nice linear and neutral monitor, whether it be an in-ear monitor or a speaker monitor. That's just the way it goes. But as far as listening goes, if you've got something really flat, it often sounds a little bit flat, and that is the case here. Now, don't get me wrong, these still sound really good. I actually prefer the sound of the original. I'll get to that in a minute. Let's finish talking about the sound, because I know not everybody has heard the P1. So the sound, it's light in bass, okay? It's got a very light bass quantity. It's a good quality bass, like the notes have a natural body, natural thickness and weight to them, but the level of the bass compared to the mid-range and the treble is very pulled back. It's a very light bass. So it does sound really nice, but a lot of people are going to find it lacking. If you're used to that, or if you like that V-shaped signature where you've got your elevated nice punchy bass, you're likely to sort of be disappointed, at least initially, when listening to the P1 Plus or the P1. But it's a good bass. The Bass extension is really nice now. It's nice and linear. It's got good sub-bass reach to it, but any rumble that you get is very light, very tight, fast rumble, and it's kind of in the background. It doesn't shake your ears, it doesn't shake your head. And now onto the mid-range, and as for the mid-range, well, it's pretty neutral, as you can tell from the graph, and that has its pros and cons, just like everything else. What can I say about the mids? It's pretty good. I do not love it as much as the original one, and it's hard to talk about this without talking about that, but I want to do a sort of more real comparison in a minute. But the mid-range is, let's just say it's fairly neutral. Vocal articulation is pretty good. The overall clarity is not, surprisingly, not that great on this. Like I'm about to compare again and I don't want to do that. Shit. There is a slight hint of sort of veiled effect throughout the mid-range. The instrument separation is good. Transient speed is very good. It's that planar driver. It's very, very fast and has extremely low distortion. But the mid-range sounds a little bit colored, just a little bit sort of thick. And before I move on to the treble, I just want to talk about that for a minute. So yes, the mid-range does have a little bit of a veil and a thickness, but this IEM responds really, really well to EQ or equalization. Normally, I don't like to touch EQ, especially when I'm reviewing a product, because that just throws everything out of whack. If I'm talking about something that I've heavily EQ'd, then there's very little chance that you're going to put it in your ears and hear what I'm hearing, unless you have the same exact EQ settings and same source that I'm doing. So as a rule, I don't EQ. But from curiosity, I did try it with this, and these respond extremely well to a bit of equalization. Just very subtle amounts, like 2 to 3 decibels. I found that a lift in the upper mid-range, like 2 to 3 kilohertz, really brings forth the vocals. It increases the vocal presence. It increases the overall clarity of the mid-range. It opens things up. It takes away all that veil. It's a really, really stark and startling difference that you hear with just a little bit of EQ. So if you do have these, or if you're going to get these, yeah, definitely try out some EQ and see what you can do with it. But back to the sound now, and let's talk about the treble. The treble is basically, again, it's fairly neutral. It does have that big dip around 10 kilohertz. So it's a little bit unusual like that. The lower treble doesn't have a lot of energy. So it's fairly smooth. It's not a sibilant treble, but it's not the most detailed or precise one either. It's pretty smooth overall, and then you get that big dip and it pops up again in the upper treble, which is mostly inaudible, but it does kind of add this, similar to what the Tin P2 did. It kind of adds a sort of a halo around sounds. It's hard to explain. Very almost intangible, but if you listen for it, you will hear it. It does have a slightly unnatural tint to it. So the treble is, for the most part, it's good, but again, a little bit of EQ can really change that, really make it come alive. So overall, the sound, I like the original P1 better, and I'll tell you why. Although the sub-bass extension is much improved on the P1 Plus, the sort of rolled off bass on the P1 worked a little bit in its favor, because it allowed that very neutral and flat mid-range to come a bit more forward, have a bit more air and space in it. The other difference with the P1 original is that it does have a very subtle lift in the upper mid-range and lower treble. It's really slight compared to the P2. Let's throw up a comparison here, and you can see the changes most notably in the sub bass, but also in the upper mid-range, lower treble. There's a little bit of an extra lift on the original P1, and that just adds vocal presence. It just breathes more life into the mid-range. It really makes a difference, which is actually the reason that initially that I tried EQ, because I just wanted to see if I could recreate the feeling or experience of the P1. Now, apart from that little lift and the sub bass, everything else is much the same. It's the same driver, it's the same shell. I don't know what changes they've made internally, but there's very little difference between the two. So if you already own the original P1, I would not recommend getting the P2, unless perhaps you struggle finding a source powerful enough to drive it. In that case, if you really love the sound of the P1, you might want to get the P1 Plus, but otherwise it's not really worth it because they're too similar. And of course we have the 7 Hz timeless, and people would go fucking nuts if I didn't do a comparison between these two. And look, you might have watched my timeless review, you might not have. I said it's very good, it does a lot of things great. It does fantastic instrument separation, nice tonality, good clarity, good detail retrieval, but for some reason I didn't quite love it. I didn't dig it that much, but I still think it's a good IEM, and I appreciate that a lot of people love it, and I understand why. Now, the main difference between these two is this one has a better, well, maybe not better, but it has more of a conventional tonal balance. So you got a boosted bass, you got a boosted treble, and you got a slightly recessed mid-range, hello, a little V. And you know, the V-shaped signature is so common because it sounds good. And it does here as well. The tonal balance is definitely more pleasing out of the box, to my ear at least, than the P1 Plus. So yeah, it's definitely got much more bass presence. It's got a bigger sub bass rumble. It's got a pretty satisfying bass. Not the greatest quality mid bass, but in terms of tonal balance and levels, yeah, the bass is really great on this. Slightly recessed mid range, whereas the P1 is very forward. In terms of clarity, the timeless has much better clarity than the P1 Plus stock tuning. You can actually match the timeless in terms of clarity and sort of airiness for the mid-range with a bit of EQ, but in stock form, the timeless, better instrument separation, better clarity, more detail, and a more livelier treble as well. Bit more energy in the treble, a bit more excitement, and a little bit more airiness. Definitely a wider soundstage on the timeless. This one has a very wide soundstage, but a very shallow one, whereas the P1 Plus has a very narrow stage, but the depth is quite good. So look, neither of them is perfect. Out of them all, straight out of the box, I would still go back to the P1, but it is what it is. Keep in mind that the P1 Plus here is about $50 less than the timeless. These are like $169. The timeless is $219. Both pretty easy to drive. The timeless is only slightly easier to drive than the P1. So that's not, power requirements are not going to be an issue with this IEM. So to summarize, look, I don't think this is going to be a hit like the original one was. Part of the reason that the P1 was so successful was because there just wasn't anything else affordable in terms of planar IEMs at the time. Well, there were other ones, there have been other ones, but the P1 was the first one that came, you know, that sounded good, basically. But time has moved on. We've now got other options available. I think in general, more people are going to like the timeless, understandably so. Myself, yeah, with a bit of EQ, I love the P1 Plus. However, in stock form, go back to the P1. I think I'm repeating myself now, so I'm just going to wrap it up, guys. That is the Tin Hifi P1 Plus. If you liked this video, give it a thumbs up, PARFAM, audiophile style. And if you're new here and you haven't subscribed, want to see more reviews like this in the future, go and hit that subscribe button now. And until next time, see you later.